it is a real joy for me to be able to be here. Let me just start right out with what Mary read about the quiet mind, the still mind, the powerful mind is significant to everything that I want to share with you this morning. And you had a little handout that I gave each of you, and this is everything that I want to say. This is everything. That clear, precise, crystal, loving, pure mind is our goal, because that gives us access then to our divine nature. That gives us access then to what in the scientific world is called consciousness. In the religious world is called our soul, divine nature. And there are four things that get in the way of that, especially in light of the Man in the Mirror song. Mary and I used that at the International Youth Peace Camp when we were training young high school and college-age people how to be peacemakers back in the 1980s and early 90s. I was very much involved in trying to make the world a better place. And I realized as I grew older and as I began to delve more deeply into the yoga world and the yoga philosophy and science, that I was going about it the wrong way. That I was very much involved in the four impurities of the mind. Animosity, cruelty, jealousy, and self-righteousness. And those are four things that I think are tough on us who are interested in social justice. Because those are some things that we really find ourselves, I don't know if you find it that way, and maybe share it in my story might help you identify with some of that stuff inside yourself as well. But I discovered that those four things were really counterproductive in my whole approach towards social justice and being able to be of service to people.
Can you repeat those four?
They're on the list.
No.
Oh no, they're not. I wanted to be positive. Okay, I'll explain. Each of the four unfold as we look at those four that are there. First of all, we need to remove the animosity by being friendly towards the happy and successful. And I thought to myself, as I was trying to make the change in the world, as I was trying to bring about happiness and well-being for everyone, I found myself getting angry with all those people who were in power. I found myself getting upset with the people who had money and weren't using it the way that I thought they should use it. And as that anger developed, it began to distort my mind. I began to forget that they were just as wonderful and beautiful as I am. And I forgot that to discriminate between what was really real and what wasn't. The mind just moved in that way. And I started to blame them for the problem when I knew, after looking on it and reflecting on the whole thing, that I was part of that whole issue as well. And so I began to then feel helpless and got full of despair and said, oh, what can I do? I can't do anything. And it's all their fault. Yeah. And I began to be really filled with animosity towards them. And that became a real bitter pill for me to even recognize and know in myself. And I realized that I needed to begin to develop friendliness, as the scriptures, the Yoga Sutra scriptures say. This is what I began to know and understand, the secret of those scriptures. And the scriptures say, no, we're not talking about trying to ingratiate ourselves to a person like Representative Thiesfeld, or a person like Congressman Grothman, or a person like Koch brothers, David, or the other one, I don't remember his name.
Ronald McDonald.
Or even ingratiating myself towards someone who I could never even get in contact with, like a president who is now Trump. Trump, who is now president. But the scriptures talk about, the sacred scriptures of the yoga tradition talk about developing an inner friendliness, where I begin to realize that I need to approach them as a friend might approach another friend internally. See, the interesting thing, I discovered that the Yoga Sutras and the yoga world is a spiritual tradition. It's not just exercise as the culture has decided to make it an exercise. It is exercise, but it's also working with one's spirit, one's thoughts, one's mind. And in that process, I then began to say to myself, well, what can I do? I even thought of the idea of running against Representative Thiesfeld and being an assemblyman, running in the fall election coming up. But then I realized I would be doing it just out of animosity, that I want to get rid of him, So I decided to call him up and ask him if he wanted to go out to breakfast. And he said, sure. And so we've been doing that for the past 3 or 4 times. And I've begun to develop a friendship towards him. He began to share certain things with me about that I'm sure he wouldn't share with Walker or Fitzgerald or some of the other people that he's colleagues with. And I began to share certain things that I know that he was shocked about. Of course, he always thought, because that was part of my animosity towards him, he always thought that yoga was the thing of the devil because of his religious tradition. But he's changed his opinion about that. And now I can call him Jeremy, and he can call me Michael. And in public, we respect each other. Dr. Ketterhagen, Representative Thiesfeld. And I say to him things that he would not ever listen to before. He would have just written me off as someone who had problems. But I tell him that he has to stand up for all people in his district. That he has to stand up against the Republican hierarchy in our state and make a decision, because he is chair of the Education Committee, to really do something about education instead of just taking money away. And he hears that. And he knows what he could do, and he's afraid, of course, because he doesn't want to rock any boats. Doesn't want to, comes out of his fear. So I began to realize that that change that I had, I was beginning to change my attitude towards him. And he began to change his attitude towards me, so now I'm able to talk to him in all kinds of ways that I wouldn't be able to before. And it was because I had changed and become more friendly towards him. Then this whole idea of the second one is, the second problem is cruelty. Now this is one I think, Mary corrected me on this, but this is the one I think I'm doing pretty well with. I'm still having troubles with friendliness towards some of the other people. I'm working on growth, but it's tough though, but it's coming. So compassion towards suffering. And I always had that compassion. But I realized that according to the yoga tradition, this is a real subtle thing. That in order for us to really be compassionate, we have to know and understand our own personal injuries, our own personal hurt, our own personal woundedness. And I began to realize that I really suffered from the same things that the culture suffers from, especially our United States culture, about being racist. Where I would see on the corner 3 or 4 black kids, and I would wonder what the heck they're up to. I would question their being there. 3 or 4 white kids, no big deal. They're just having fun. But I realized I had this racist construct in my head. And then I began to wonder why. And I began to realize that it had a lot to do with how I grew up. First of all, I was a white farm kid in a white farm community. Lake Ivanhoe was in next to Lake Geneva there, but it was only talked about. We never went there. It was in case you don't know what that is, it's an entirely black community situated in like a little ghetto all by itself right next to Lake Geneva, near Burlington, where I grew up. But I was a farm boy, and when I went to school, I smelled like a farm boy. It's impossible, if any of you know what farm is like, raising cows, it's impossible to get that cow smell, the barn smell, out of your hair. It's impossible. I wash my hair 4 or 5 times every morning. Still couldn't get it out. Anyway, the clothes were from the farm, so that anything that happened in the farm was... And because of that, I was ostracized in many ways from the rest of the city kids. And I was picked on, the bully. You know, the bullies would come out, just like they do in the culture today. And so I realized that that's where I was identifying with, that hurt and that pain, and I was projecting that out. So my compassion really was questionable, even though I thought I was doing, and I really did do, a lot of wonderful things, and have done a lot of wonderful things in reference to people who are suffering and in turmoil. However, sometimes I was cruel, and that's where that cruelty is, that next part. And anyone, of course, we know that cruelty is something that is really even more difficult for people who have a lot of wealth and a lot of power, because they want to be able to keep the poor down. So the next one that was problematic was I really was jealous of people who had it, people who had, in the scriptures of the yoga tradition, the jealousy refers to jealousy of spiritual advancement. In other words, you're supposed to be cheerful towards the virtuous or spiritually successful. And I thought to myself, how in the heck could I ever be like a Gandhi? How in the heck could I ever be like a Mother Teresa? You know, how could I ever be like, now in my culture, my Catholic culture, Francis, Pope Francis? How could I ever be like? And so I would feel a little bit of jealousy towards the fact that they must have had some options and opportunities that I didn't have. And I began to then look at that in those ways. But then I realized that the jealousy wasn't just spiritual, but that I also began to be jealous of people who won the lottery. I became jealous of people who succeeded in developing... I'm going through my inner voice asking, should I say this? Okay. I began to wonder about why certain people were successful and why certain people weren't, and why I wasn't, why I didn't have the money that I know that would be, I wouldn't keep it for myself, it would be great, all the things I could do with it and stuff like that. And that jealousy then I realized was problematic. And it even spilled over into this idea of trying to create a cooperative grocery store downtown in Fond du Lac, besides the Center for Spirituality and Healing. I also saw other people, other organizations much more successful when it came to raising money for the center and stuff like that. They seem to survive much better than the center. We have trouble even making our rent sometimes. But I realized that jealousy spilled over into that physical world and was not helpful. It was not good and worthwhile. So I began to release that, and I began to realize that all of those people whom I think are just so much more powerful are made of the same image and likeness that I'm made of. They're all divine, infinite, and perfect. They're all, as I say, dips. Divine, infinite, and perfect. And I'm not any more of a dip than they are. And they're, so I realized that I could approach them. And I could ask them, I could tell them, well, would you like to contribute to a grocery store downtown? Would you like to help support the work that we're doing with those who are abused and those who are mentally ill at the center? Would you like to? And then things began to change. People began to say, yeah. And I wasn't afraid anymore. And I was, because in the fact, right away, it would be out of jealousy that I would be asking them, but now it's not in those ways. And then the last one that I'm having most difficulty with is this last one, and non-judgment, because to the non-virtuous. And when we talk about non-virtuous, we're talking about the people that we think are really sinners, to use a Christian term, to use a Greek Orthodox term. What's Christian too? Really terrible and rotten people who are really abusers of the environment, abusers of women, abusers of people, abusers of, and I became really self-righteous. That's that next one, Audrey, the last one. And that self-righteousness put a real wedge and a barrier between me and my relationship with them. When I realized that I was, and the word that's used in the Sanskrit is upeksha. And upeksha used to be translated indifference, that we were to be indifferent towards those who are criminals, those who are liars and cheats and thieves and stuff like that. But it really doesn't mean that. It means being near them and seeing near them closely. In other words, seeing in the whole context. And what's the whole context? It's really difficult to live in a culture where of poverty and loss and not being able to have the things that, first of all, that you see on TV, or first of all, that you want, and that in order to even have your own dignity. So what do? You go out of your way to do it any way you can, and the laws and the rules of the middle class culture and the upper class culture just go out the board. You do what you can to get the money. And I realized that in that whole context, they would do exactly what I would do. They're doing exactly what I would do if I were in that context. And then the reason I find this difficult is because sometimes I really get self-righteous about people who are very well off. And then I found out a little bit more about that David Cook is really interested in prison reform. Of course, he comes from a different perspective. He comes from, because it's financially just not feasible or wise from his perspective. But we do need prison reform, and he and I agree on that, in those things. And I have a little trouble with our president because I have a lot to agree on with him. However, I am beginning to look at the fact that he is so self-centered, and he is so similar to the other dictators of the world who are self-centered and who want power and glory. That's the same reason that he is that way, because he grew up that way. His dad really had a hard time with him, and it was tough on him. And so I don't agree with what he does. I'm not saying that we should agree with people, as Jeremy knows, Representative Thiesfeld knows, and as Congressman Grothman is starting to know and realize, although I'm getting responses from him. He's calling me back, not him, but his servants, his people are calling me back, his secretaries and stuff, and I don't think he's ignoring all the letters that I'm writing him anymore, because I'm realizing that that his number one goal in life is to really foster. He's told me this second-handedly. But he's also, I heard it from friends of his, that his number one concern is family. Of course, by family, he's talking about a man and a woman together. And I keep nudging him and saying, if you're so concerned about it, and he said, yeah, I am, well then, let's pull together a conference in our district or in Congress about family, and invite everyone who identifies with that name to that conference so that we can hear all those perspectives. The LGBT perspective, the single mom and the kid's perspective, the single dad and the kid's perspective, the two older people who live together now. They're not married, they live together, they call themselves a family, and then they got this extended family over here and here. He hasn't done it yet, and I don't know if he will. But he knows that there's that need to have that happen in order for him to really do and serve. And I realize now that the reason he is all over the place in our district, it's going to be really hard to defeat him if anyone wants to defeat him, or anyone wants to have a different perspective as congressman, because he goes to every factory he can go to, he goes to every place that he can go to. Why? He has no kids. He has no wife. He has no family. No wonder family is so important. And so I began to really know and understand people a little bit differently because of what Scripture says. And that has helped clarify my mind. And then I'm not agitated and irritated, and I can sit in meditation, because as it says at the bottom, all of this needs to be changed. The mind is changed through meditation and light. And so I'd like to share with you a little method, a really simple little method of us being able to move ourselves to that point of one pointedness, clarity, and so that our mind can consciously realize that we're dips, divine, infinite, perfect, and we have this quality just like everyone else does. And it's where we sit in as still, stable posture as possible, and we breathe in through our nose, and we fall in love with our breath, and we fall in love with the sound of the breath. And it goes like this. And I'd like to lead you through that. So if you could sit as still and stable as possible. I know I'm going way over time, and I apologize for that. Scott told me, Michael, we want to get out of here at 11 o'clock. But I didn't say that. No, he didn't say it that way. He said, we're really important about that. So with your eyes gently closed, then please become aware of your sitting nice, still, and stable, and notice the breathing, and notice the breath coming in your nostrils, feeling the cool air come in, and the warmer air come out. And begin to feel the joy of that cool air coming in, and the warm air coming out, the joy of that life force in and out. And begin to enjoy that. Begin to fall in love with that. And as you're falling in love with that, just gently say to yourself, so, as you inhale, so. And as you exhale, say to yourself, hum. Don't say it out loud, don't vocalize it, just allow it to come from the center of your head. Feeling the joy of that breath in and out. And stay in love with that breath. And notice how clear the mind starts to become. Notice how peaceful the mind starts to be. As you begin to touch the dip in you. Namaste.